So friends, on behalf of the Bahá'i Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya University, I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished panelists and participants to this webinar on bridging the gap, addressing the crisis in child education with the COVID pandemic. This is the 8th in the series of webinars being organized by the Chair to explore the social and economic impact of the COVID pandemic on India's most vulnerable populations. Before we ask our panelists to share their valuable thoughts, I would like to say a few words by way of introducing the theme for today and the issues that we would like to explore in our discussion. Among the most damaging consequences of the COVID pandemic has been the closure of schools in the past year and the impact of this on the education of millions of children. In India, over 1.5 million schools were reportedly shut with the onset of the pandemic, which affected an estimated 320 million students. The damage to the cognitive, social, psychological, and emotional development of the child due to the loss of a year of in-person schooling is too complex to estimate. The path ahead remains uncertain, leaving parents, teachers, and students in a state of confusion and despair. This unprecedented year-long closure of schools has also had ripple effects beyond the field of education. The closure of Anganwadis and government schools has deprived millions of children of childcare and of a reliable and regular source of nutrition through programs such as the midday meal scheme. Within the household, girls and women have been the worst affected. With children staying home, their burden of domestic work has increased, which has reduced the time available to them to engage in remunerative or educational activities. More alarmingly, there has been an increase in the incidence of child abuse, child labor, and early marriages. While a large percentage of schools have simply remained shut throughout the year, others have attempted to carry on the education of children using the internet. Using online means for education, however, has not been without its own share of challenges. There are stark inequalities in access to the internet and in the ownership of smartphones and tablets, especially across gender and class divides. Even for those children privileged enough to have access to online education, the teaching learning experience has been marred by various limitations. Most schools did not have systems set up prior to the pandemic for online teaching. Thus, most teachers have had relatively little time or experience to prepare for instruction over this medium. For children, the inability to access or understand online learning sessions has resulted in higher stress levels and behavioral changes such as increased aggression and irritability and the inability to concentrate. As indicated by several studies, the lack of in-person interaction has had an adverse impact on the child's social and emotional development. There have been various formal and informal measures undertaken by the government, civil society organizations, educational institutions, as well as parents and communities to address these issues. Yet, given the unpredictable course of the pandemic, a return to normalcy may take much longer than expected. In such a scenario, all those concerned with the education of the child will have much to learn and adapt to in the months ahead. For the state and civil society organizations, the challenge is to ensure that those who have lost a year of learning are brought back into the educational process. Where online education is being provided, teachers and school administrators will have to ensure that the quality of the teaching learning experience is continuously enhanced. Parents have the difficult challenge of having to manage the time of their children, cater to their social, cognitive, and emotional needs with empathy and patience, and create a home environment that is conducive to focused and disciplined study. While all of this can understandably be overwhelming for parents, the community has the role to play as a support structure for parents in their educational responsibilities at this critical time. Eventually, to address a crisis of this magnitude will require proactive involvement and collaboration between all those involved in the process of educating the child: teachers, school administrators, parents, the community, civil society organizations, and the state. It will also require a profound shift in society's attitude towards its responsibility for the well-being of children. Attending to the growth and development of children is not a function that can be exclusively assigned to a parent, a teacher, or a school. All of society bears the responsibility for molding the mind and character of its next generation. Through both acts of commission and omission, society leaves its stamp on the tender hearts, minds, and bodies of its youngest members. The development of a child is not a subject that can be siloed to a specific field such as education, or to institutions such as schools, or to government departments for child welfare. The interests and well-being of children will have to be a fundamental value guiding all policies and programs for social and economic development. It is a moral imperative that institutions such as the media, the market, the political system, and the legal system will have to continually uphold and reinforce in public consciousness. It is, after all, one of the signs of a mature society that it is able to set aside absorption with its own immediate cares and desires, and nurture and foster the development and well-being of its youngest members, those who bear within them the seeds of our collective future. The Baha'i Chair is organizing this webinar to discuss, on the one hand, the immediate crisis of the loss of learning that children all over the country face due to the closure of schools for a whole year, and on the other hand, of the opportunity that this crisis provides for bringing fundamental changes in society's orientation towards its youngest members. Friends, before we invite our distinguished panelists to share their thoughts, a few housekeeping points. Our participants are requested to share their questions for the speakers through, or their comments through, the Q&A box. This will be the means by which the panelists will be able to take up your comments and questions, and we will have time devoted after the first two speakers have spoken, as well as at the end of all four speakers making their comments, to take up your comments and questions. Today, one of the panelists who we initially had on our panel, unfortunately has fallen ill, and in her place we are privileged to have Mr. 𝗕𝗿𝗀 𝗃𝗀𝗂𝗰 join us on this panel. So I would like to acknowledge that at the beginning before we welcome our first speaker for today. I would like to invite Professor Rohit Dankar to make his comments. Professor Dankar is a professor of philosophy of education at 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗹𝗂𝗰 University, Bangalore. I would request our speakers to try and stick to the 15 minutes allotted. And if there is a little bit of, going beyond the time, then I will try to be as gentle as possible in reminding you. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Fazli. You can be very direct with me, and I'm doubtful whether I'll take 15 minutes or not. But my friends Poonam and Madhav and Mr. Sogi can use the remaining time, so that should not be a problem. Also, I should say in the very beginning that I don't think I have something very profound to say. I have some speculative things based on my experience on teaching children of primary and upper primary children level. And I would like to share those thoughts. The first point I wanted to make is actually more or less adequately taken care of by Professor Fazli. And that is actually more to do about availability and efficacy of IT in online education. It seems to me that availability is much less than we think. I deliberately looked into, and this is, I'm not giving this information as any kind of reliable sample, but more as an impressionistic a way to form an impressionistic view. I tried to look at 2-3 rural areas, actually in 2-3 villages in Rajasthan, and these villages actually have lots of smartphones. You can imagine that if someone has not reached home for time of dinner or and sitting in the village somewhere else, then their wives call on the phone rather than sending a child or something. So you can say availability of the phone to adults. The problem is that these phones are not available to children for very long time. And they are strictly rationed, as well as they are available more to boys than to girls. Another problem is that any teacher would know that the screen of the phone and interaction with the books and other phones simultaneously. I have experience of teaching 2 or 3 children actually during this COVID problem. And there seems to be a very serious problem in communicating properly in this. The third thing I'll just mention, wouldn't elaborate upon, is that the kind of material we are using is simply text pages rather than any sort of properly designed learning material or online learning material. But my real objection or my real worry about this is that almost all the attempts by the establishment have been on the online only. And that seems to me to expose a kind of very strong middle class bias of city dwellers who actually govern education. They are imagining that the kind of family support which is available in their homes to children is available throughout, and the kind of IT resources that are available to their children are available everywhere. So this is again, like everything in our education, when a crisis comes, this focuses on a particular segment of the society and the fringes of the society remain outside it. So that is one thing. I do not know what to do about it, but I'm just pointing out. Second point is something which most people will disagree with me, and therefore I would, and please keep the time, sir. I would try to dilate a little bit more on the second point I want to make. It seems to me that some of the measures taken to deal with this situation, they worry me. I will start with, cutting the syllabi by the CBSE. And they thought, most of the people hailed this view, this move as, reducing stress to the children and several other things. I was teaching mathematics to a 9th standard child who was actually entering into the formal proofs in geometry, and the chapter which actually defines the basis of formal proofs, that is axioms and postulates and definitions of Euclid, was removed from the syllabus. And this child is supposed to enter in that area of highly structured logical argumentation without making that basis. So that is one problem. But then if you go further down the line, and if you look the way examinations are conducted and the use of internet and Google Baba in examinations, etc., then this worries me more. And I would say a few things which I'm not certain at this moment. I'm certain in my mind, but they could be contradicted easily, and I'll be happy to answer questions or at least engage in a dialogue on them. You see, this idea of cutting the courses whenever there is some kind of crisis and diluting examination is a kind of, you can say, manifestation of another idea which is very prevalent and deep in our society. And that idea is that the relationship between the certification and knowledge and capabilities acquired is very weak. The real issue is acquiring a certificate of every class every year. Real issue is promotion. Real issue is tag that you have reached from 8th to 9th and 9th to 10th. And there, if need be in a crisis, then the standards and requirements of the curriculum and the knowledge and capabilities which should go to certify pass in the 9th standard can be dispensed with. This is a widespread idea in our society. It seems to me that the nationwide, when we are trying to use these kinds of measures, then we are reinforcing this very dangerous idea. And this dangerous idea seems to have implications from use of coping in the examination, unfair means, not actually studying well, but trying to get good grades. It seems that education, rather than acquisition of knowledge and capabilities and attitudes, we see as a matter of ticking up some boxes. So I ticked up my 8th standard, I ticked up my 9th standard. In ticking up my 8th standard in mathematics, I ticked at 94, 95, 98. Whether I can understand that, whether I can utilize that kind of knowledge or not, seems to be undervalued. And it seems to me this 1 year, and this is continuing actually, it might be more than 1 year now, is going to reinforce this breach between capabilities and certifications in our society. Unless until we take some very clear measures. Second thing in this, I would like to say, I do understand that the loss of learning is important for children. I'm not certain if when I look at the rural area, whether other kind of psychological effects are loss of learning and schooling or being cloistered in very small places and not getting a chance to get away from parents who all the time would like to control you or give you directions, etc. So losing that free time when you can do what you feel like, you can be yourself and don't have to be judged all the time. That problem might be more in the cities and in certain areas, and maybe less in rural areas. Keeping that thing in mind and understanding the loss of learning is very, very significant. And here also I'm putting this thought more to deliberate upon rather than a firm conviction at this moment. I do not know which one is more harmful to a nation, whether this increasing this breach between knowledge and certification or delaying my certification by 1 year? I'm not certain. And I'm not saying that one or the other is the case, but I'm opening this question and it seems to be deliberated upon. Why does it come to my mind? We have an experience of one time not having adequately prepared teachers, adequately qualified teachers, and we said that something is better than nothing and introduced para teachers. Now we recognize fully well the impact of para teachers on dilution of the notion of teacher and teaching in India and its devastating effect on teacher education. Are we going to discover similar kind of effects of this increased breach, say in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years from now? That is one question which might be unreasonable, but I thought I will share with people here. Next point I would like to make is, I have some experience of teaching primary school children and upper primary. It seems to me that no kind of technology assisted teaching learning alone, forget about half-baked telephone-based technologies, can actually teach initial language and mathematics to children. That requires very direct experience with the world and a living human beings who can moment by moment look into the child's mind and assist at the exact level that is needed. So it seems to me that, and that seems to be the greatest loss to me, because the preparation at that level and when children are ready to embark upon, formalizing their intuitively received concepts and understanding, that part is being lost. It seems to me that very few schools have tried. There could have been a way in doing this, and that could have been actually few schools tried. We also tried with a limited success because of various reasons, not because of the weakness of the concept. You see, in the rural societies at least, there was never a complete lockdown within the villages. People who are coming from outside, etc., of course, they kept their distance, but within the families and extended families, they interacted with each other quite freely. And in almost every extended family, you do have the children who are of first, second, third, fourth standard, as well as the children who are in secondary and higher secondary, etc. One thing could have been, and some people tried that taking all the care to avoid a spread of COVID, giving a certain kind of capabilities and instructions to the older children, and some specially prepared material to be used with the younger children. And this could have been avoided to a significant level in the rural areas, at least to my mind. I cannot claim so firmly on this, on the city, but the kind of colony in which I live today, this seems to be possible. So maybe colony-wise and mohalla-wise, and there should have been much more emphasis on direct teaching from that perspective. One more thing I would like to say, and as I said, Professor Fazli will keep my time. I'll try to.
If you can just conclude in 1 minute.
Yeah, 1 or maybe 1.5 minutes. Yes. It also seems to me as a teacher a bit of a loss of opportunity. We keep on talking again and again of going outside the 4 walls of the class and connecting education to the life in general. And when there was a crisis, what did we do? We actually reduced even that scope, and through the IT, we again bound the children to a screen. It seems to me that it could have been possible to, at least till 8th standard, to do a lot of work through understanding the local situation in real life and reflecting upon that, preparing reports on that, sharing that, deliberating upon that. It seems to me a lot of social sciences, mathematics, language, and sciences could have been taught through various kinds of, and I'm deliberately avoiding the word project, the various kinds of ways of exploring your real environment, social and physical. And that should not have been very difficult to construct such kind of studies. I believe that at the primary level, at least, we have plenty of such studies constructed already because of various reasons. So anyone can construct them, to my mind. It seems to me that we did not explore that part of it. Thank you very much. These were some of the thoughts which I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dhankar. We will have a chance to, engage with the many, openings that you have introduced to this dialogue by raising, the one hand, the issue of justice in terms of the middle class orientation of, the education system. And also the crisis that this pandemic has revealed in terms of the system itself, the gap between, or the breach between certification and actual capabilities that are developed. And I particularly like the idea of the loss of the social space of a school, which actually allow the identity of a child to develop independent from the home space, which is an idea that hopefully we can engage more with, at the dilution of the content of education with the introduction of technology, and also the concept of, or the notion of the teacher. So very rich openings that you have provided us with. We are privileged in this panel to have a diversity of experience and backgrounds. We have two academics, Professor Dhankar and Professor 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃, very distinguished in their fields. And then we have Dr. Madhav Chavan, who is again very distinguished as the co-founder of Pratham, one of the largest NGOs, and Mr. Payam Shogi, who is the principal of Riverdale International School. So we hopefully this discussion is going to benefit from all this diverse perspectives. Going forward, I would like to now request Professor 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃, who is a professor of education at the University of Delhi, to share her comments.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Fazli, for thinking of inviting me for this webinar. I think there have been a series of attempts made by various organizations and platforms to discuss the issue of education during the pandemic. And as rightly pointed out by Professor Dhankar, there are several issues which need to be looked at closely. Given the short space of time we have, I will try and flag some of the issues that I think have not been looked at even within the education community, so to speak, a little bit closely, because we've all sort of been taken literally off the ground into the digital space as if that is the only future for education, which of course the state also has been pushing. So school closure, a lot has been said in your background note itself. I think you flagged very critical issues. I would just like to sort of reiterate the fact that school closure has not only impacted the 320 million children across the span of education in India and of course across the world also, but I think the impact has been far deep and more difficult on the marginalized, as we have seen that when the thousands and lakhs of migrants walked rejected by the city and the ugliness of the inequity of our society that was visible during the pandemic, we found that several government schools were sort of left completely empty, not only because of school closure, but these children never came back to school because they had already left the city. And there are reports that have been suggesting by various organizations who have an interest in privatization of education, like the Central Square Foundation, clearly saying that the low fee paying private schools have closed down and the government needs to look at options by way of supporting such schools, maybe consider them as MSMEs and try and use public money to support low fee paying schools, which are actually exploiting the poor, I would say, in many different senses. So we need to look at these issues very closely, and the fact that the inequality crisis itself should be seen as an opportunity for the educator community and any other community that's walking right into the space of education, whether it's the corporate world or whether it's a different kind of NGO world. I think it's important to look at inequality as a central thrust of our curricula and pedagogic imagination post-pandemic, especially as we saw very, very deep, blatant, gross middle-class apathy that was, of course, leading the state to take certain decisions. And to my mind, digital education, digital online learning is really a new form of exclusion. So we've added another layer to the entire problem of inequity, which is not only in terms of caste, gender, language, religion, community, but I think even educational inequality. And we've been sort of blind to the fact that educational inequality has actually really sort of magnified much before the pandemic, and the pandemic is only making it far more difficult. So the attempt to shift the site of education to the online mode is actually visible in the NEP 2020 and the various kind of push that happened in different states. And I can tell you various interviews I read or articles I've read, and people have written extensively that even state education ministers, let's say in UP, while they acknowledge the fact that 18 million children are there and out of 18 million, only 2.5 have access to digital technologies, we are still going to bridge this divide. Now, how are we going to bridge this divide is, of course, a huge question. A state like Kerala that boasts of high literacy rates and politically social consciousness, we find 51% of the urban having access to the digital devices and methods, and only 23% in the rural areas. So clearly, economic inequality that has talked of the top 10% hogging up the wealth of the bottom 70%, it looks as if a large number of our children are really completely excluded from this push that has been coming for digital education. And I've been doing a little research in this area, looking at the impact of the COVID and the impact of the digital mode of learning on education, right from the primary school to higher education. And we find a high school student of class 11 in Delhi telling us that out of 80 students in her class, only about 20 or 30 were actually able to attend classes regularly. And the teachers don't quite care why the other children are not able to attend, because they have their own accountability measures to look after. And governments have told them very clearly that you need to just sort of follow instructions which has been given to you, which means materials, whether they're in the form of worksheets or whether they're in the form of YouTube links, were actually given to teachers to pass it on to students on WhatsApp groups, and the little agency of the teacher that was sort of little left as a residual after post the neoliberalization of education and the corporatization, I would say, even that little agency disappeared because governments were telling teachers that please do not interact with students. You're going to mess up what we are trying to do. So only work as conduits of passing on information. And there are several other nuances of the narratives that we've collected, but I personally think that we need to look closely at this whole problem, this crisis, which is not only an overall school education crisis, higher education crisis, but the learning crisis that all bilateral agencies have been talking about. And we do know, and I think Asar's reports have been sort of flashed all over, telling us how poorly our children are doing. But the funny thing is that even before the pandemic, we never addressed the issue that this learning crisis could be connected to the fact that there are children from first generation learners, that there are children who do not have teachers in their classrooms, that there are schools without adequate resources, and that the learning crisis is linked to systemic issues which are not being fulfilled in order to enable learning, or the whole idea of Amartya Sen that poverty is not an economic dimension alone. The very fact that children are poor may put them away from accessing school, but the point is that even when they access school, actually they are being marginalized from the very processes of learning. And I think learning crisis is connected to the whole question of caste discrimination, communal discrimination, discrimination on gender, language, and so on. And I think we need to look at the learning crisis not only by way of addressing it through the digital mode, because those very children who are in the crisis are unable to access the digital mode. And my submission here would also be to remind us that the very idea of quality education before the pandemic had been reduced to simply learning outcomes. And if we remember, the Niti Aayog very clearly said that even the right to education needs to be actually looked at as the right to learning. Now, if a policy level thinking can suggest that education is nothing but learning outcomes, then we have a serious problem. And I think the pandemic has only taken this agenda forward because it is during the pandemic that we pushed for digital platforms with very little understanding that most of our marginalized children are actually left out of that process. So the British concept, the colonial concept of linking quality with privilege is something we could never handle even during 70 years of our independence. But what we are doing now with the pandemic is to strengthen the idea that quality and privilege are deeply linked, and that quality education cannot happen if you are underprivileged. And somehow we have to accept the fact that there will be more and more children left out of this crisis. So when we reduce the idea of quality to learning outcomes, then the digital mode actually is the best mode to go forward, because we can now say that we will give a common curriculum to everybody, we will set out the learning outcomes, and we will make sure that teachers are able to communicate a homogeneous idea of what maths is, what social science is, what language is, and in the name of treating everybody equally, I'm putting that in quotation marks, because that actually means homogenization. It does not mean respect for the diversity that this country stands on. And the pandemic and the push during the pandemic to sort of create methods of addressing the learning crisis is actually moving in terms of accentuating the inequalities and the digital divides and the problems that the children are already facing. And in this, I'm glad Professor Dhankar flagged the issue of the teachers. I think the teachers' agency is something that many of us have been working towards to create, But even before the pandemic, the teacher was reduced to a mere pawn as a state implementing agency. Today, through WhatsApp groups in Uttar Pradesh, teachers are scared to even say that they don't have all their children on the WhatsApp group because they will be accountable. So they simply say yes, and television blares the fact that 90% of Uttar Pradesh teachers have created WhatsApp groups, and we are reaching out through the digital modes to children. I think the teacher agency is a critical question. We are, through the pandemic, losing out on the very idea of subjectivity and reflexivity, which are the core of quality education. In the name of objectivity, we are giving the same curriculum, which doesn't sort of look at questions of diversity. And we are in the danger of losing our rights as learners, our rights as teachers, our rights as citizens. And we seem to be surrendering these rights to new kind of experts that have come into the market. The marketization process, in any case, was already in process. And now we have the new digital learning experts, technological experts, technocrats, and the intellectual agency of education, which is the rightful space of a teacher, the rightful space of a learner and of an ordinary citizen. We are going to surrender to the digital expert. And that is what is worrying me. And I personally think the point of the loss of social space that Professor Fazli, you took out from Professor Dhankar's talk, I think is something we've been fighting for. But if you reduce schooling to mere learning outcomes, then where is the question of the social space? The digital push is actually going to completely take away even the meanings and purposes of education that not only philosophers across the world, but in our own context, in the anti-colonial struggle, flagged for us and created for us the need to make curriculum and pedagogy a deliberative exercise and not an exercise in universalism. The digital push is taking us towards a new kind of universalisms where we are not talking of human rights, where we are not talking of universal liberty or fraternity, but we are talking of universal ways of looking at the world, universal ways of looking at why religion should be the center of our lives, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to say, but I would say we need to sort of look at the anti-caste struggle, the discourses that emerged 100 years before the nationalist leaders gave us Nayi Taaleem or integral education or Shanti Niketan, and we need to bring the anti-caste discourse and the anti-colonial discourse together to speak to each other, because the epistemic shifts in the quality of education help sort of prompt us to look back to Mahatma Phule, to look at the idea of Tritiya Ratna, which is really opening up the third eye as the major purpose of education. Can the digital mode give us that? Can the digital mode help us to even address questions of diversity, discrimination, prejudice, casteist ways of looking at things? Can the digital mode look at the diversity of this country, which should be the mainstay and the raison d'etre of our education in the frame of equity and social justice, which is what our Constitution commits for all our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Batra, for this very thought-provoking contribution, where the question of agency and the loss of it has really been brought to the fore, and how in the guise of universalizing not just the content but even access, actually the process of exclusion is also being taken forward and being reinforced, and then also bringing to the fore this clubbing of quality with privilege. So there is a question, maybe we can take a little bit of time and discuss some of these comments. The question is basically asking about solutions. In other words, while we have all researched and found the facts and statistics of the digital divide and the extent to which our society continues to promote quality education only to a specific segment of the society, and inclusivity has only been theoretical till date, the question of how to bridge the gap becomes imperative. We all probably know the issues, but would prefer to listen to solutions. So Professor Ďankar, towards the end of his comments, he did refer to the need to understand the local situation and how there were possibly various ways in which other arrangements that could have been made for children in primary schools, for example, to actually interact with the real environment, and that the digital solution need not have been the default solution. But it's a question, and it would be helpful to hear what alternatives exist. In other words, how could this cookie cutter approach have been, not been adopted, and something that responds more to different realities at the grassroots? How could that have been an alternative, and may still be one in going forward? And what are some experiences that exist that can teach us? So I don't know, Professor Batra or Ďankar, if you would like to share any thoughts on this.
I would say one or two sentences, wouldn't take long. It depends, how do we look at this gap? If we think that the digital resources are necessary and we should equalize the opportunity to access to them, then I might express my doubt about that, because that depends on many more things in the society, including where you live and the kind of resources your family can afford. But if we want to bridge the gap between learning opportunities, then it seems there is a possibility. One possibility is and again, I'll take it from NCF 2005, and before that Gandhi, and before that Dewey, that you connect learning with real life. So once you connect education, sorry, not learning, once you, and learning is a means to get educated. So once you connect education with the real life experience, think, reflect on that, formalize your experiences through the language, study various kinds of situations, compare. Once you take the children into the real life, then this gap disappears, because some sort or other real life is available almost to everyone. So the capability to reflect on that, but that would require a change in the very pedagogy as well as the content of education, and which is theoretically defendable, practically doable, but it will require a lot of work. That could be one way of doing it. Second is, as I already said, involving students a little more in helping each other, and the internet and teacher and textbook not being the sole source of knowledge, but interactions between them could also be considered as educative activities. Perhaps we pay attention to these two things. There is a possibility moving forward. I don't think this is a perfect solution, but then at least I don't have a perfect solution at this moment.
Professor Batra, would you like to share?
Yes, I'd just like to flag the idea that if we consider education as only focusing on learning outcomes, which is what the policy focus and a lot of the new actors who've come into education emphasize, then digital learning is a mode that is very sort of fits very neatly with that purpose. But we need to sort of revisit this idea. And I think we need to release the idea of education from just learning outcomes. Because real education, as has been said, is about connecting with life and with the social milieu. I mean, the learner cannot make sense of learning or of text, of curriculum, unless the learner is able to resonate with that in terms of his own social milieu. That is exactly the point that the Yashpal Committee in 1993 made, that the burden on children is not of the kilos of textbooks weight, but of non-comprehension. And the non-comprehension is because there is no way to enable the children to make meaning, which means our focus has to come back to educational process. And the digitalized form of education cannot do justice to what we call an educational process. And therefore, we need to look at curriculum as a future path, as a solution-oriented path. We need to look at curriculum as a deliberative exercise. We already have the NCF that has given us a path. We have a teacher education curriculum framework that dovetails well with this idea. We have a right to education that takes both these ideas forward through a central legislation. But it is strange that the NEP 2020 does not even acknowledge the right to education as an important stepping stone to take education forward for the next 5 to 10 years. So the solution lies in looking at curriculum as a response to the diverse contexts in which our diverse learners are learning and the diversity of teachers. And this cannot happen if we have a blueprint of how to teach, a blueprint of a lesson plan, or a blueprint of what should be the outcomes.
Thank you so much, Professor Batra. I also wanted to maybe ask both of you to expand a little more on this idea of agency, which seems to be, in a sense, at the heart of the kind of change that we are seeing, which is, in other words, how does one unlock the power to change? In other words, our consciousness is raised. We are aware of injustices. We see how the education system has become complicit to a social structure which is unequal and which keeps reinforcing these inequalities. There's an absence of social justice. That is very much there, and technology becomes a tool in that oppression. But then the question becomes then for those within the system, where does agency come from? And I think probably the speakers who come also, who will be speaking, who are yet to speak, will have much to say. But it would be helpful to hear your thoughts about the question of agency. Also thinking of it in terms of communities. You see, because why did education become the exclusive preserve of the state, of bureaucracy? Why did it then, the alternative to it, only become the business? Isn't the need for education a right that, like you said, it is a fundamental right that society as a whole has the right and has the duty to expect and to foster, both at the even not just in terms of getting children educated, but what kind of curricula they're being educated. Why is it that communities have such little agency in the way children are being educated, in whether they are being educated, and in what education is doing? And how can it be enhanced? Now, communities also, of course, includes teachers within. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
Yes, I think that, the question of agency becomes very critical, not only in terms of the community and the ownership of the community to be able to educate its young, but why have we not been able to have an agentic community, or why have we not been able to have a community of teachers who have the agency? I think that question becomes important. I would just like to flag a couple of systemic issues here, which have led us to where we are. And I think one of the critical issues is specifically with regard to elementary education, that the education of teachers at the elementary stage is happening within state-led institutions, out of which, of course, 95% are private. So, it's happened by default. And there's been a sort of a political economy in this space. And I think we need to understand that where teacher preparation is happening without any link with the higher education system, without any link to research and the frontiers of knowledge, sources of knowledge generation, such as higher education, notwithstanding the fact that our higher education is also in a mess. So I'm not unaware of that. But the point is that we are preparing our teachers in intellectually isolating environments, bereft of any real engagement of thinking. And the system of education has, at some point in time, post the DPEP, come to the conclusion that our teachers are incorrigible, that our teachers cannot be reformed. So first they start off by reforming teachers, and then they say, no, we can't even reform them. So now we're going to tell them when to dot the I and when to cross the T. Now the point, therefore, is that we have systematically, through policy and through policy measures, systematically thrown the teacher off the road of education. She's not even on the margins now. She's actually an irrelevant person. And with the digitalization, we've just got a circular in Delhi University that tells us that 40% of our courses should be in the digitalized mode from now on. So, the teacher is not required. So I'm not talking of the staid old argument of technology substituting the teacher. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about real education and real agency. Now, if the teacher, who is the critical link in the whole process of curriculum, pedagogy, and processes within the school or higher education practices, and if we take that, जिसे कहते हैं ज़रूरी कड़ी है, right? That missing link. If we take that link away, how do we expect the edifice of education to be owned by anybody? So today the teacher is as prejudiced as any person who denies the fact that there is caste, who denies the fact that there is communal tension and that there is effort by several state governments to fan the communal tensions. Why? Because the teachers are not even part of the process of engagement. They don't know history. We will tell them what history is. So agency has never been allowed to develop, even when we glorify a pre-colonial time, when we say we had a Guru Shishya Parampara, when we say our teachers were revered. I would say even there was a Brahmanical nexus that kept the decisions going as to who would be taught and how and why not. So let's not glorify our past as well. What we need to take into account is that to unlock this power of agency, the teacher will have to be brought to the center of her own preparation. So that in a preparation program, like we have been able to demonstrate through the 4-year Bachelor's of Elementary Education program, that aspects of identity, aspects of a vision of education doesn't have to only come from Tagore, Dewey, Gandhi, and Pestalozzi, but that young people who are trying to develop a career in teaching, let them think about what vision should be about education. Let them tie in their own identities to this task of doing, educating the young. Because after all, education is about people. It's not about creating chemists and physicists and historians alone. So I think that very element of human agency is lacking, not only from in terms of a protagonist such as the teacher who is the main actor, but it's lacking from our curriculum. It's lacking from our pedagogic understanding. The fact that pedagogic communication can reinforce power relationships is a question we never ask, is a question that sociologists have asked, and it's remained in the black box. But we've never really tried to integrate that. And policy makers have always been very keen to not invest in education by not investing in teachers. And that's the reason why the private sector, the contractors, Lovely University is one great example in Punjab. People from all walks of life can come and put up institutions to train teachers. But what is that training doing? It's actually disempowering them. So to unlock what is called teacher agency or community agency, we have to help them to become at the center of that process so that they feel an ownership to what they are doing. Right now, the social distance between even the government school teacher and the children who come into government schools, who are really the marginalized, the most marginalized, who cannot even afford the 500 rupees of a low-fee paying private school, they are left in that state system. So nobody seems to care. There was an interesting Allahabad court judgment that said that all government employees should send their children to state schools. I mean, that's not going to work, but the point is, it's an interesting thought. The middle class left the state government school long, long years ago as a result of this nexus between quality and privilege. And we created cocoons for ourselves. I think the biggest challenge for ourselves today is that, are we interested in taking our people along? People who sit in webinars, people who discuss these issues, people who sit in armchair academics and try and look at these issues. Are we seriously wanting to change ground realities or not? Because agency can only come if those who are on the ground realities are made the center of these discourses and imagination.
About a minute on this, if still there is time.
Yes, a minute should be fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, agency to me is not a random, willful action or expression. It seems to me very closely linked with what some philosophers have called rational autonomy. That is a reasoned choice to do this or that, or to not to do this or that, or say that. Now, this is interesting that Kant wrote an essay long back, I think 17, I have forgotten the exact date, but 250 years back, that this is very difficult for humanity to graduate to adulthood. He calls it that depending on others' opinion and regurgitating that, living in their shadow, is a kind of childhood, self-imposed immaturity. And emerging out of that requires a bit of courage and certain kind of social situations. I agree with Professor Batra that our social situation, particularly for teachers in the system and their preparation to form convictions based on their own understanding so that they get the courage to articulate them, the opportunity is not available. But there is also another thing in this, and since there is time limited, so I wouldn't go into that. We don't notice what are the kinds of forces within the society which actually push people to toe a particular line of thought. a particular line of academic discourse, a particular party line, a particular ideological line. And if you say anything outside that line, then you are dubbed as not understanding this or that. That is also a kind of pressure on people to lose their own autonomy and make a choice to toe the line. That is applicable on teachers as well as, I would say, in India on academics. Please, let's pay attention to it. How many academicians are capable of making their own judgment and express it in politically incorrect ways if they come to that conclusion? How many academicians do have the courage to come to such conclusions based on reason? I think that's another point we should pay attention to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dhankar. I'd like to now invite Dr. Madhav Chavan, the next panelist who we have the privilege of listening to. He's the co-founder and the former CEO of Pratham Education Foundation, one of the largest NGOs working across the country with millions of children every year, focusing on basic learning outcomes, including reading and math. Handing over to you, Dr. Chavan. You are muted. You'll need to unmute.
So I said your question is how to bridge the gap. And the postulate is that the gap has increased and we need to do something about it, right? Simply put. My first question is, how do we define the gap? There are two kinds of gaps as far as I can see. One is you can say the haves and the have-nots, and there is a gap between what the haves get out of education and what the have-nots get or do not get. And you can say that this is that the haves have got more out of during the pandemic because of various digital learning solutions, etc., whereas the have-nots have not got. As a result, there is a widening of the gap. Initially, there was an X gap, and now you have X plus gap between the two groups of children or people. That's one way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it may be that the education system was asking you to do something for everyone. And the gap as to where you wanted to be and where you have reached is also true for everyone. So even those who have gone into digital learning solutions have not reached where they wanted to reach, or they could have reached, and they don't. And so there is a gap there also. There are a lot of people, so 10th standard and 12th standard students who want to appear for an exam and they can't appear for the exam, and there could be a gap there as well. Or they feel that their whole year they have not been able to prepare, and so what Professor Dhankar referred to as the cutting down of the curriculum and so on and so forth. So that there is that kind of gap as well. I think there is this discussion about the gap is going on around the country and around the world indeed, I think, without actually measuring what the gap is. We are all assuming that there is a gap and that the gap is widened. And that may well be true, but we don't know really how to measure this gap. What is it? What was the gap? How do you measure what the gap was before? And there is no way of knowing that. All you can say is maybe certain middle class people, and that brings us actually now to the bigger, larger question of the purpose of education. What is the purpose of education? The gap may be that from the lower income, socially deprived categories, fewer children are completing their secondary education or higher secondary education or graduation. That could be a measure of the gap. You could say that the opportunities available to the upper classes to make a living thanks to whatever education they have, even if they have a very bad degree, they can end up in a higher level of living just because they have purely simple contacts and maybe something that they have access to, which gives them the opportunity to access better life than the others. So there are various ways that you can look at and say, what is the purpose of education? Are the children from the poorer backgrounds, backward socioeconomic backgrounds, are they going to get the opportunities? Are the opportunities that they had available to them thanks to education to rise above poverty or getting out of the trap of poverty, as they call it, have they reduced as a result of the pandemic? That could be another way of looking at it. And I don't think we really do know any of these things. We really don't know. Everybody is basically going by what they feel is happening or should be happening or could be happening. Numbers wise, we really don't know because it'll take some time. How long will it take to figure out what the long term, as you said, I read out that background paper. The real cost of it is something incalculable, and it'll take some time for us to figure out what the real cost is. Now, I feel that there are two things that are coming out of this lockdown situation, pandemic situation. One is suddenly everybody has discovered that it is not just the school, but it is the parents and the communities that are also important for children's education. Because the school is shut down, and if the school is not present, the school is not running, the teacher is not available, or teacher cannot teach in the classroom, then the responsibility to get the children to learn something or the other, or educate the children, if you don't like the word learn, rests with parents. And so everybody's been trying to do, whether it is forming the WhatsApp groups or whatever, but basically we are saying, school band hai, so do something and get the parents to do it. That is the first big thing that has happened around the country. Otherwise, we were thinking of parents and communities only in terms of school management committees, which functioned or didn't function. We were not talking about getting parents enabled, empowered to teach children, their own children. And suddenly now we've woken up to the fact that that is going to be important. Now that we should not lose. In the years to come, we should not forget when the schools seriously reopen, again going back to business as usual, where teacher teaches and in whatever form, and parents don't participate, is not going to happen. It should not happen. We have been working in the communities for a long time on a very large scale. One of the names we've come up with is called Anganshala. So a volunteer or a few parents together with the children in a mohalla create a learning group, and they try to learn what they have because the school is closed. But this sort of a community mechanism of learning is something that should be persisted with. It's a useful thing to have. The question then is, how and what will they learn? Are they going to learn through this community groups of learners, or whatever you call it, mini school, Anganshala, as we call it? What are they going to learn? Now, and how are they going to learn? Because these are not teachers, these are not trained teachers. So then how is this whole process of education going to happen? During pandemic or after the pandemic? So that is a question mark that we will have to answer. We'll have to respond to that. The second thing that has come out of the pandemic, and it is a, what do you call it, two-edged sword, is that suddenly everybody is obsessed with digital technology, either positively or negatively. And it's as though suddenly we think digital technology is going to solve all the problems. And I think that there's a huge myth about that, and that is not correct. I have been experimenting with use of digital technology in communities for learning, and I've learned a few lessons. Like Professor Dhankar says, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but there are some very interesting lessons that come out. And they all point to the fact that there are two things that you must think about, because the global situation is changing. There was a time when we didn't have railways, then the railways came, then we didn't have telephones, and the telephones came, they didn't have radios, the radios came, then televisions came. So from a communication point of view, there has been a dramatic change in how the human society behaves. And this digital technology, mobile technology, is a step beyond, if not ahead or whatever. And that is going to occupy the human society for a long time to come, until we come up with something completely radical which we can't imagine today. And so we have to all deal with that. And the children of today, when they grow up, they will have to deal with that. The integration of technology in the society is something, and in the economy, in everything. Even if you are a farmer, you have to deal with technology. You will, in fact, will benefit from dealing with technology. It could be there could be other, and you should be able to guess what is not good technology, what is bad use of technology, and so on and so forth. So there are two things, I think, on the technology side that we need to think through. One is that there is the learning of digital technology, which is being underplayed. And this is something that India has suffered from for centuries. We did not put tools in our we actually told them that if you work with your hand, that's not education. You should do brainy things, and that is education. If you learn this ideas, but if you are a technician, if you're an artisan, that's not education, and that's a very bad thing. First of all, that needs to come back. We need to get our children to learn to work with their hands, whether you call it Nayi Talim, I don't know what else you will call it, but that's a very simple thing that in Indian homes, people don't know how to work with their hands, and it's looked down upon, and we cannot have that. In relation to digital technology, learning to use a cell phone is one thing, but learning about the cell phone technology is quite another, and that's something that we should be able to tell children, because there's a lot of scope for that, and that's not difficult to do. What is inside it? Because your towers are around, and so understanding the technology, I'm not saying from a point of view of getting a job, but you have to understand what this monster is. If you go to the internet and search 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗃 and BlackBerry, you will find a story that this well-known director has told. I don't know how many of the participants know this story, but I might recount it in half a minute. So 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗃 had a BlackBerry which was not working. If anybody remembers what the BlackBerries looked like, and the ball on it, which moved the cursor, was not working, and he was about to buy a new BlackBerry, and he wanted to get it repaired. And repairing also would cost a very high amount. And he was passing through Juhu, and he saw a board that says mobile repair, or whatever it called. And there was a young kid there who repaired it for him for 500 rupees and told him कि जब use करोगे तो हाथ धो के use करना. That was all that was wrong with it. And he opened the BlackBerry and fixed it. Now, this young kid in the Juhu slum, which 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗃 is honestly telling you that this was so, he learned this simple thing, and that simple skill of fixing a mobile phone, a middle-class child doesn't know. Is the gap reversed or not? So the technology can be a great leveler, because you don't necessarily depend on whether you know high-level physics and mathematics. You can be, don't make a mistake. I'm not talking about jobs. I'm talking about being educated. I'm talking about what is the meaning of being educated. There are many things that people will talk about. But I think today it is possible, first of all, and a lot of children have learned to deal with technology during the pandemic. That is one. That's a positive that has come out of this. They've whatever, whether you like the WhatsApp messages or not, how to deal with technology, by force, the parents were forced to give technology in the hands of the children and so on. That is one. And the second one, and I guess I'm going to run out of time shortly, is that it's not just the learning of the technology. I think people have misunderstood the use of technology. The big digital technology lobby is all about taking the technology and replacing the textbook, taking the technology and replacing the teacher. The whole positive part of what technology is and what it can do is not explored. I'll give you one story of what we were in the very early days, 5 years ago, when we distributed tablets in 400 villages, 3,000 tablets. And people said, you know, how are you distributing tablets in the villages? They will be broken, they'll be stolen. And what we found that the tablets survived for 3 years at least, and there were more. Okay, so the children took good care of them. When we put some things in it, the presumption, according to some of our people, and including me, was we are going to give children something, even if it is interactive, give children something to learn from. Okay, so it was like we giving you to learn from. And what we found was children were making videos with the tablets. And they were trying to tell us what they knew. This is a huge opportunity. So you don't have to necessarily go on telling children what to learn. It can be a very useful tool for children to learn. This is the way that education should. If you want constructivism, then there is a very good constructivist tool that the technology can be. The other thing in this technology also is that the school, and it's in conflict with the current school system and the education system, because we have a linear system. Now, there must be education theories why the things are that way, that you do standard 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and 5, and so on. The peculiar thing about digital technology is when you are looking at the internet, you don't know what you will land up. You will get a news item saying Nobel Prize given to physicists who explored black hole. And then you want to know black hole, the answer can come. Earlier, it was all in English. Today, the material can come in your Indian languages as well. Earlier, it was about reading. You can today only hear. So the technology is changing dramatically, and we have not decided how we are going to use technology in education. We only are going linearly. We are simply taking the technology and putting it like a textbook. So I think
you can just
look at all
conclude,
this,
Dr. Ch
yeah,
in 1 minute.
I will. Half a minute. So the point is that there are all these things. We have to define the gap, understand what the gap is, and work at it. We cannot only extrapolate from our experiences that this is going to be the gap, and hence that is what I want to work on. This is the possibility of a fresh start is there. Whether the governments will do that or not, I really don't know, because the previous governments don't do that. This government may not do it. So that's a completely different thing. But we need to innovate in the society and do many more things. Anyway, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chavan. I'm sure in the discussion that will follow, we will have an opportunity to explore more some of these, especially related to the opportunities that digital technology and its use have potentially that they provide, which is one of the points that you raised. But before that, I want to invite the next speaker, Mr. 𝗵𝗱𝗀𝗂𝗀𝗶, who is the principal of Riverdale International Residential School in Pune, and who he has more than 20 years of experience in school education. So over to you, Mr. Shah.
Thank you, 𝗕𝗿𝗍𝒂, and hello, everyone. As was mentioned, I'm just filling in for the fourth panelist, and given a choice, I would have rather sat with the attendees and benefited from the very young and knowledgeable Ms. Martha, who was intended to be here today, but she's not well, and we wish her a quick recovery from her ailment. Thank you so much for having me over. I wish to take one idea that has been mentioned in the background paper, which is about our own attitudes towards education. And I think the pandemic has brought this out very clearly. And if there is any one positive thing that has come out of this pandemic, it is this, that it has shown to us our attitude and our mindset and our predisposition towards this larger question of education. For example, I'll give you some examples, and my discussion will be more on the ground so that there are actionables that can emerge from them, because we would like the participants and everybody, including myself, to go away from this webinar with clear ideas of things that we can do about all these discussions and challenges that we have been talking about. So, what has happened during this pandemic in terms of carrying forward the process of educating the youngest members of our society? Let's look at it at the level of policy. Policy said shut down schools. Well, not safe for children to come. Pandemic, children's health, very important. So we decided on the easy way out. I call it the easy way out because there are countries that actually decided that education of children was too important and too vital to just ignore. Now, I was looking at the internet. There are Denmark, France, Italy, Netherlands, to some extent, China, and Belgium actually in its policy paper is mentioned that normal return to school is government's #1 priority. So once they decided that children have to come back to school, then they made the remaining policies as to now what should happen in order to support this. But I think, now when I mention these things, I'm not being critical. I'm just mentioning to make a fact, bring out a point. So please let's be judgmental or good and bad. The human mind generally thinks in terms of good and bad, black and white, but that shouldn't be the case. It's just that this is what we opted for, maybe because of many reasons. Now, if you ask people, they'll give you a lot of reasons why this happened. But the point is that we kept our children out of school, which was, I think, an easy way out, and we could have done things maybe a little bit differently. And other countries have shown that it could have been done. There were some countries where they opened the school, children were infected by the coronavirus, they shut the school, they opened it back again because they kept on, because for them it was important to get children back into school. And they kept at it, and they did, and many countries succeeded at that. So that's one. Coming down at the level of parents. Now, I'm talking about attitudes. What are our attitudes in our country, in our society, towards education of children? If you ask me, this was an opportunity where the parents had to rally around schools and come and say, all right, we have a challenge here. What is it that we can do together to make sure that our children are cared for? Communities, neighborhoods coming in together and saying, what support can we give? What else can we do? These are tough times. These are challenging times. Let's do something about that. But many parents, what did they do? They started haggling on fee issues. They went to court. There were court cases being fought on fees. Well, my child did not attend school, therefore why should I pay fees? So attitude towards the all-important subject of education of children. I'll tell you from my own experience, it's an extreme case, but it has happened in many such cases that children, Professor Dunker mentioned that there are use of unfair means and all of that happening, but here are parents supporting children in doing that. Parents helping children to use unfair means and justifying and coming back when we found out, they're coming and telling the school and trying to take a side with the student. Extreme cases, parents during a crisis and the question of education and learning, but the attitude isn't quite there. Coming down to the level of the teacher, well, the teachers had to struggle, and I have every word of appreciation for all the teachers who took up the challenge. They have their own limitations. Many of them were not tech savvy, but they did it. They learned how to organize online classes and to deliver classes and engage the students in some sort of learning because that was the only thing that they could do. But what did they do? They picked up the textbook again and started teaching the textbook online. So I personally have a big problem with the textbooks. The National Curriculum Framework of 2005 has a big problem with textbooks. I always question a teacher that if you want to really question your own abilities, ask yourself this, whether you can go into the class confidently and teach a 45-minute or 35-minute session without the textbook. If you can, God bless you, you're a very good teacher. But many of us over the years have developed this dependence on textbook. And that's what happened in online classes, textbook and the same using keywords and the kind of things that we do in normal classrooms started happening in online classes. So what did this do to the students? They burned out. They soon burned out. There were students who would come earlier on. They were excited with this new platform of digital learning. They came with a lot of expectation that I am going back to school, even though virtually, but they had that. But gradually we started noticing that they are keeping their videos off, that they are keeping their mics off, that they are not even participating anymore. And as the year progressed, they just shut off. I'll give you an example. You know, I run a school for 10th and 12th, and we are affiliated to the 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃 in Delhi. There are, in the final exams, there are the theory papers, which are out of 80 marks, and then there are the internal assessment marks for which children have to submit project. Can you believe when I say that many children did not bother to submit their board exam projects for those 20 marks? They did not. They were completely shut off. That I have had enough of this and I can't take it anymore. And that happened. And we had to go back and forth with the council and try to find a way, extend their time, help them so that their marks do not go down. So this is the reality of what we have seen during the past 1 year of the pandemic. That somehow the priority isn't there, the attitude isn't there for education. We are talking about community, we are talking about civil society, we are talking about government. It's true, the background document says we really cannot entrust the sole responsibility of the education of our younger children to any one individual or any one body. We cannot take that risk. Many parents have some, how do I put it, have some very old ideas about what their children should receive in the form of education. The reason for, and it's not their fault, frankly, it's not their fault. For me, the gap that we keep talking about, digital gap or class gap or privilege gap or gap of opportunities, I think it's mostly because of the parents themselves. The parents in the rural areas, the parents don't bother what is being given to the children. In the so-called middle class and the urban setting, parents have their own ideas of what they should receive. Therefore, they enforce that on the schools, and schools have to comply. The schools generally are being run and they are governed by the mindset and by the demands of the parents. Now, in all my 25 years of experience, I'll tell you what parents demand. You know, parents, when they come, they ask questions which are very standard. We know during admission time, we know what kind of questions are going to come. So what has been your past board exam results? So we know that this is what they expect from the school. Therefore, the school has to make provision to give board exam results. How many buses do you have? How many classrooms do you have? What kind of infrastructure do you have? And so on and so forth. These are the standard questions that we are asked, and therefore the schools have to provide all of them. I haven't had many parents asking me what kind of value education program do you run, for example, or what kind of skilling program do you have? How are you going to prepare my child for the future? Now, these are not issues with the parents. So they come and they demand certain things that are very, very constrained and limited in their application and scope, and we know that. The job market situation is changing. When you apply for a job, they don't look at your certificates and report cards anymore, their mark sheet. They give you a link and they test you for your critical thinking skills. That's the future. This is the present. We are already there, but we are still harping on rote learning, textbook learning, and all of that. So whether the pandemic, whether online learning, whether classroom, in-person classes, doesn't matter. It is the same process. We needed to adapt. Online classes, teachers took the textbook, whereas they should have adapted. They could have adapted. And there are a lot of examples. I'm grateful. We talk about civil society. There were many agencies. The agencies of United Nations quickly came out with documents. For example, in one document, they said that activities that can, Professor Dunker mentioned this repeatedly, and it is there in the National Curriculum Framework, that learning has to be related to real life experiences. So you give a maths question to the children that if there is a containment zone of 1 kilometer radius in your area, which areas are covered in that? and this covered geography and maths and integrated curriculum and all of that. But teachers did not go far enough to adapt the curriculum to keep the children engaged and keep them interested in learning. And as I mentioned, over a period of time, they lost that interest and they just shut off. Many of them actually shut off. So we need to really worry about our own attitudes. In my experience, if we have the right attitudes, we'll find a way. I'm always guided by this mythical example of 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃. You know, 𝗕𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃 was a poor tribal person who really wanted to learn archery, but his Guru Dronacharya, refused to teach him. So he went ahead and learned it in the name of his Guru. Now he had to pay a price for it, but the attitude was there. The thirst for knowledge was there. He wanted to do that. But I think that's the solution. We have to create sufficient awareness so that the motivation, that thrust forward comes from within. Now, many parents don't really care, or they have a limited expectation of what their children should learn, is because they themselves did not have a very stimulating educational experience when they were in school. And it's not their fault. This is all that they know, and this is all that they think. The National Curriculum Framework of 2005 has harped on 3 things and is revolutionary. Now we are due for a new document. But they talk about competition in schools. They say competition, excessive competition, is damaging. It's damaging the ability of children to learn. But 16 years later, we have not changed that. Children coming to our schools are learning to compete. And right from the playground to the examination hall, they are forced to compete. And I use the word force because it is unnatural for human beings to compete. We are social animals, if you like to say that, but we are noble creatures. Human beings have been created noble. Therefore, it comes naturally for us to want to harmonize, to cooperate, to live together. There's something abnormal happening, but that's happening because parents want that, because in the job market, cutthroat competition, rat race, and therefore my child will be left behind. He has to learn competition, which is not so. A lot of competition is affecting our children. Now, whether there's a pandemic or not, these are some principles that are happening. The other thing is student-centered learning that the NCF has talked about. Many schools in their brochures and their websites mention we follow national student-centered learning without actually knowing what it is. Student-centered learning means structuring the curriculum and the methodology of teaching learning that suits them. Now, I ask you, our class periods, are they aligned with the attention span of children? Attention span of children is very low, but we have 45-minute class period. So it's not really child-centered. The manner in which we teach, the manner in which we assess our students, it is to the teacher's convenience. The whole system has been made to suit the teacher because we have to complete portions. We have to complete and test certain portions. We have to generate a report card, which makes it easy for us to assess comparative progress of children. But in the process, we are ignoring the effort that children put in. So we are just interested in who comes first, but not the effort that has gone there. So I think it's more in the context of our own attitudes. I think that is something that we have to start looking at as parents, as teachers, as administrators, as policymakers, civil society, everybody. Do we have the right attitude towards education? Do we have the right expectations from education? I think the pandemic has shown us otherwise, that it is not entirely there. And if we fix that, if we can quickly come to a common understanding of what is it that education should be doing for us to bring out the nobility that we know exists in all human beings, that brings it out, that human beings show that nobility in their relationship with one another, in their decisions, in their actions, then we are going to get somewhere. And all these other questions of divides and have-nots, I think, will then gradually get addressed as well. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I have consumed my time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shoghi, for your comments. I think it has helped to also bring out the central role of, which is also tied to agency, which is the question of the attitude that not just individuals, but in whole institutions and a whole society can have towards education and children more broadly. And I think also your remarks have helped, in a sense, show how some of these attitudes are embedded within systems. And so, for example, parents create certain imperatives for schools based on their demands, and this then creates a cycle of expectation from the institution, from the community. But then I think one thing that one takes away is the idea that if one is committed to a conception of nobility and is willing to work towards it, which I think also encompasses the idea of justice, then there is a room for initiative, for agency. So we have a flood of questions and comments. We may not be able to answer all of them. I would also request the panelists to respond to questions in writing on their own, but I'll try to take a few of them. 𝗕𝗿𝗶𝗀𝗃 asks, the current research and discourse, the way I hear it, seems to be focused on connoting learning with only formal school learning. If one is talking about Rohit's approach of education with real life or authentic experiences, then perhaps this pandemic has a silver lining in theoretically defendable and practically doable partnerships between scholars and practitioners. Any thoughts on how to undertake and promote these partnerships? So I think Dr. Chavan's comments about these community mechanisms of learning, which I think he was talking about Pratham, which have come about during the pandemic, seem to indicate these spaces which have come into being. And then also what we were sharing about technology, that it's not only knowing how to use technology, but understanding technology. The opportunity, in a sense, it is a deeper level of consciousness, if you will. And one could take that our discussion further and say that it's, you see, the question is, are you a passive consumer of technology, or are you a society? Are you a community? Are you a people that gradually has a vision that gradually becomes, capable of taking ownership of technology and using it in ways that are empowering? So I don't know if any of the speakers would like to comment on this question. I think there's a lot. One, for example, and I'll just say this last thing before handing it over. Again, if you look at technology, there is also the question of the values embedded in technology. That some would say is efficiency, which is usually technology is upgrades based on certain values like efficiency, speed. But some would say those may not be the most important values that a community may need. Maybe justice, maybe like the open source movement, for example, has shown that even choices could be at the level of the kind of values we embed. And so then this question of maybe scholars, the partnership, and how this room for agency can be opened up. can be looked at in these various dimensions. Please, I request the panelists to share their thoughts.
I would like to make two very short comments, though I do not know whether this is the place to do that. Actually, no one questions that technology has become important, and we should know it. We should also understand how it works, etc. And if possible, we should control it. By the way, let me just leave a question. I do not know how many of you control your own computer if you have Windows yourself, and how much someone else controls your computer, and how often that person wants you to. But of course, you can learn that. The problem was that seeing technology as the silver bullet to solve the problem and emphasizing everything on that. So taking technology as a tool for my purposes, which are decided by humans and through human judgment, and knowing the technology and using it efficiently are two different things. No one objecting to learning and knowing the technology and using it efficiently. The problem is that even in the internet, and let me tell you that I use a lot of internet, particularly for books and journals, a kind of human judgment in what you do and what material you look at, what material you rely at is extremely important. And I am doubtful whether a blind search and exposure will ever develop that kind of judgment without interaction with other human beings and reflection. That is one part. Another thing, with a bit of apology, I would like to say, this is an old tech actually to say that attitude of the parents is the real problem. You see, the system would say, if I am an administrator and an IOX officer, I would say, these are the teachers who cannot do anything. And the teachers would say, which has already come here, that what a teacher can do if students don't come to the class, and what a teacher can do if parents don't take care of. Let's try to understand that school was invented when the society realized that education of the children cannot be done by a single human beings in the household. And therefore some experts are needed. Now those experts are turning back and telling the parents that you do the education. Particularly in a society with deep division and a large population who are underprivileged and never went to the school, or maybe went to school but do not understand the situation of the society very well, expectations from the parents are a bit too much to my mind. Another important thing too, I'm sorry, very, very quickly. You see, this idea of 𝗕𝗏𝗃, that if you are motivated, you will do. For last 3,000 years, we have only one example of 𝗕𝗏𝗃. And that poor fellow also lost his thumb. So how many more 𝗕𝗏𝗃s do we have to mention in last 3,000 years in this huge population? That is not to deny that self-motivation is an extremely important point, but that is also considered job of the educator to motivate a student on that path and create that kind of energy. 𝗕𝗏𝗃 was lucky and unlucky both simultaneously. He somehow got this energy in himself, which the society didn't like. But at the same time, this is our job as a teacher, and I'm speaking as a primary school teacher at this moment. This is our job as a teacher to raise that kind of jazba for learning, etc. So this is an important aspect. We should think of that as well. Also, this is the situation, I agree with this. But I personally have been, and I'm not alone, I think ancient Indians and Socrates has been extremely worried about this, that the private institutions whose sustenance depends on the parents' wishes, they are under a pressure of certain kind. And the job of the educator is to take human mind, development of human mind in one direction, and this economic pressure pushes in the other direction. it seems to me, and I'm sorry to state it so bluntly, a school which completely obeys the parents' dictum is never going to be do a good education. Good education also have to have a certain kind of higher ideals which may not be common, and everyone, every parent, or even the majority of parents may not agree to. Now, this could be objected from both kinds of people. Those who actually think of education very highly, but at the same time think that the parents are the final and last authentic view on education, which I seriously doubt, as well as the people who think that pressure is unavoidable. Now, maybe this is a controversial comment and it will do some good. Thank you.
Professor, Dr. Chavan wanted to share.
Yeah, good that we are having from a discussion, we are going to a debate, I think. My feeling is schools were invented at a time when there were few literate and educated people in the society. Or the access to knowledge was very limited through only a certain number of people. So you had few people teaching many. And the current situation is that even in India, by the old literacy measures, we are reaching close to, whenever we do the census, I suppose, we will reach a point where there will be 85% literacy by some old measure. But it's without a doubt that there are many more educated people in the society, rural, urban. People have more knowledge than we used to have 100 years ago. There's no question about it. Now, that alone says that the school model, the model of education, of transferring knowledge or whatever you call it to the next generation that was invented 200 years ago, call it 300 if you want, is outdated. And that people have said a lot, a long time. It has to change, it has to change, it has to change, and it is not changing. It is so rigid and it is just unshakable. So, and the pandemic actually has shaken it up. And maybe another year it is going to shake up. The question is, how do you respond to that? And I'm sorry, Rohitji, I think the age of Ekalavya has already come. Think of Ekalavya and archery may not happen, but look at how many women at home have learned, and I have, in pandemic, I've learned cooking from YouTube. So, and this is not trivial. This is not trivial. People are learning from the internet directly, so many different things. How to convert that sort of a learning, informal learning mechanism into a formal learning mechanism is a challenge. And it will take some time. But definitely this is the era of Ekalavyas. And there is no need for Dronacharya at all. So if you, and I'm a big proponent of this. If I can read things, if I can practice things and show myself that I'm actually better at something or I've learned something, the question is, where is the certification going to come from? Today, the monopoly of certification is with certain institutions. And that's breaking down. The whole idea of why certification, degree milegi to job milega. Actually, that's breaking down. That's not true. In a country like India, only 9% of the workforce is salaried employees. So even if you get the best degrees, it's unlikely that you will join the job force. You will have to start doing things on your own. You may be an agriculturist. So that whole sort of connection between degree and job and degree and livelihood, certification and livelihood has actually completely broken down, but we are not looking at it. Even Google tells you that if you come to Google, if you have the skills that we want, we'll take you. You don't need to have a degree. And this is going to change. I think this is going to change. So it's all about, when you talked about the gap, there are different gaps that we have to talk about. Today, if there is a child's growth, you look at height weight changes, and there is a predictable change. And if it doesn't happen, you say the child is malnourished. There is no such measure for education. Now, and definitely not one uniform measure for all. But the only measure we have is this fellow's 10th standard passed, that is 12th standard failed. No, that is not good anymore. We have to develop new measures of what you have achieved, how educated you are, how accomplished you are, and it may not be according to the old standards. So I think the pandemic has actually thrown open this whole subject as to how you are going to deliver education, and we need to rework it very seriously. It has to be. It is being reworked. When you say, Mr. Shogi says that children were saying, I'm fed up, I don't want to learn, that is exactly the kind of rebellion that's going to happen. I suspect that a lot of children are already not taking school seriously. I did not take school seriously. I enjoyed going to school. But as a place where teachers taught and I learned, no, it wasn't. When I interacted with teachers to do creative things, it was fantastic. And I loved my teachers. But if you taught me something from the textbook, that was not what I wanted. And I think this change has been there coming for a long time. We have to work on it. The gap will be redefined then. It will be redefined. When a middle class boy is stuck in a rural area with his car not working, how does it work? Where is the gap? You may know everything, but you don't know, you not really, you don't know everything. So the gap is reversed then.
Mr. Shogi, please.
A quick comment. We've been hearing about the use of pedagogy in schools, and we've been talking about that. And Madam Batra also mentioned that in pedagogy. Some comments also I just read from the participants. We have to be a little careful. It's not so easy that we come and say that, all right, I will stop using the chalk and talk approach and start using, for example, participative learning, experiential learning. Now the new education policy says that this is the way, or cooperative learning, or some other, or inquiry-based learning, and all of that. You see, one of the things that my hope has always been that teachers will try to do, and I try to influence them both as an administrator of a school as well as a trainer of teachers, is to help them to promote higher order thinking among students. So children start thinking. Unfortunately, our educational system currently generally does not do that, because you see the whole manner in which textbooks have been arranged. You have the text, then you have a set of exercises at the end of the text, and the answers from these exercises are back again in the text. So, and there are some teachers who are so helpful that they help the children underline the answers, so the children don't even do that little bit of exercise of trying to search for the answers. So there's not much thinking happening. Now, if a teacher adopts a pedagogy, a methodology that helps children to start thinking, framing questions is a very good way of helping children to think. Give them a text and let them frame questions. So there are many ways of doing that. But then you will have to be prepared for a lot of other consequences. For example, if you have a classroom where children are becoming thinkers and they start thinking for themselves, they may one day question the teacher as well. Are we prepared for that? Are we teachers prepared to have a classroom full of children who are going to question me and my method? So we have to be careful, and we have to be conscious, and we have to be aware of a lot of things that are happening between the student and the teacher and this education process. It can be formal education, it can be informal, it can be somewhere in between, but there's much more to it than is apparent. So the deeper we go, the more conscious we become, and hopefully we pick up actionable points that really matter. Thank you.
You're muted.
Yes, no, I just wanted to take another question, which is from Sandeep Kumar Malik, who says, how can the gap between student, teacher, and curriculum be bridged in this time of the pandemic? What role can parents and the community play in this process? So just, I don't know, just building on to some of the comments that have been shared, I think Dr. Chavan, set the ball rolling by talking about how the pandemic has really, in a sense, it's been disruptive of the old model and forced us into reconsidering, thinking about the possibilities for new ways of learning and new ways of configuring the relationship between the content, the curriculum, the student, and the teacher. So this is, it's a very provocative idea that in a sense there are these opportunities that have opened up And that, like Mr. Shogi was also sharing, that there are certain ways of teaching that have just, in a sense, their outdatedness has become very apparent. And so is this a moment, or is this an opportunity to really think radical, or will completely new ideas just remain on the fringe, and we will go back to business as usual once things get. So it's just to build on to what Sandeep Malik's question is, how does one bridge this gap? How does one, in a sense, come out of a structure that in the first place creates that gap?
Who's taking that? Professor Batra is going to say something.
Yes, well, there were a couple of things which I thought I should say as we sort of come to the end of the webinar. It seems to me that, questions of livelihood attached to education over the years have become very prominent and important focus. And now, of course, we are also looking at, trying to understand that there is no relationship between the kind of jobs that education traditionally was able to give, and there's a huge change taking place because of technology and others. But I think there is another question related to education and its purposes, which we seem to have forgotten, whether we look at it as embedded in the anti-colonial struggle, or whether we look at it as embedded in, subaltern sort of thinking, which is the question of education and society. I mean, after all, we shouldn't be just worried about livelihoods. That is an important issue. But I think the kind of society we want, the kind of social cohesion, the kind of plural fabric that we are proud of in our country, which of course has been threatened over these past many years. And also the fact that marketization has actually reduced education to a commodity. So we are tending to look at education in that frame of marketization. And in fact, it's not surprising that many people are actually talking about using the pandemic to create ICT products for underserved communities. So profit making seems to be becoming a very major sort of thinking around education. So I think we need to look at all of this critically when we look at technology itself. There's a question here in the chat box where people are, saying things like, how do we help students to sort of participate when they just mute their mics or when they just shut off, as one of the panelists was also telling us, Mr. Shogi. And I think it's the other way around is also true. I mean, teachers have control of that screen, of that computer, and I can just mute any child I want to. I can just shut that person up completely. So I think the digital mode needs to be looked at far more critically than just an aiding process in taking us towards a 21st century, post-21st century kind of imagination of education. It's important to understand who's controlling education and for what reason, and what are those vested interests. That'll also make a difference. The other thing is that our experiences are coming from such diverse sections of societies. Rohit is coming from a completely different cohort of people that he's working with. Mr. Shogi is coming from a completely different section of society, and so is perhaps Dr. Chavan and myself. And I think we need to recognize that there is no uniform way of looking at either increasing motivation of children. In fact, we've forgotten many of these have become truisms, that children are naturally curious, that children want to learn. We have shut that up actually through the way we educate them. So now we are reinventing ways of how to motivate them. So perhaps the key actors in education will help us bridge the gap between the child, the curriculum, and the teacher. The teacher is the critical link, I think. If we focus and invest a lot in the teacher by way of taking, because that becomes a community involvement, and the teacher then brings in the parent community. And schools have been resisting parental involvement for a long time in the most sort of privileged communities also. But I think it's important to bring that up. You know, 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃 𝗃𝗍 spoke about this 200 years ago. It's just amazing that we haven't brought those ideas back in terms of how we can enable an empowerment process to happen through education only by way of bridging these gaps. And that's why that question is very important. There is a huge gap between the teacher and the curriculum because somebody else is deciding curriculum. And I would fault even the NCF 2005 there because it didn't speak of the teacher as an agency, but just spoke of the teacher as somebody who has to be oriented to a new curriculum. I think the teacher has to take ownership of creating that curriculum. So far as we continue to live with the understanding that we know best and we will tell teachers and students, we are not going to change anything. I think we have to be humble and we have to be self-critical and we have to be open to the idea that people who are on the ground understand their children, understand their lives, and they have to be made part of the curriculum discourse.
Dr. Chavan, you wanted to?
Yeah, I think we keep coming back to the question of the gap. And I think I really don't know whether we can bridge the gap in that sense. What you can do is at the lower level, how can you raise the levels higher? Because the gap is a very relative kind of thing. You can measure gap in different ways. How are you going to raise the level of children who are coming from weaker social? And that question has been there before the pandemic. And we have not addressed it fully. The question is the so-called digital response going to be useful in that or not going to be useful in that? And what do you need to do? Because now there's going to be a huge worldwide marketing machine which is going to say, put digital, do digital, do digital. And I think that's not necessarily, as somebody said, it's not a silver bullet at all. Whether it is in the developed countries or here, and as Mr. Shogi's example showed, we don't know how to deal with digital technology in education. That there is a lot of experimentation needed, learning needed in doing that. And let's focus on basics of where we want to take. Now, education, I agree that it is not entirely and only about livelihoods, because that's different. You want to create a better human being. But the problem is the better human being is a political definition now. And when when the one who controls the government actually says this is the philosophy, this is the way, you can say you must go according to the constitutional values, and tomorrow if the constitution changes, then so I think there is no question that you want a better human being, but if the whole society is not sure what a better human being is, then we have a serious problem. And I don't think you can entrust the teacher and the textbook to tell the children that this is being a better human being. I think these are very difficult, troubled times, and we need to deal with them, and not because already the education is a political akhada. So how to deal with that is a completely different situation. So ye gap ke liye you have to take a view from the education, whatever curriculum point of view, and say, how will you raise this higher? The problem with the curriculum, whichever way you look at it, is we call it over-ambitious. It's setting goals for children to learn things that are probably not required. And we have to reconsider this. What is the curriculum going to be? And it's not about just somebody deciding what the curriculum is. When do you reach that curriculum? How do you access it? How do you master it? Do you need to master it? Do you master everything? These are questions that are completely open. And as I said, we really need to take a look at the whole system, so-called, or the method that we use to educate our next generation. School is a part of the solution, not the whole solution. And I would say, therefore, school is a part of the problem as well. Think about that.
Friends, we have gone a little beyond our allotted time, so we will have to conclude. But before that, I would like to invite the panelists if they would like to make their closing comments. I don't know who we can, maybe Mr. Shogi, we could start with you.
Well, there's, there was some mention was made about change, that we need to look at change. Assuming that we have become aware of what needs to change and why it has to change, then it boils down to two things. The hardware for change is, of course, creativity. We come up with creative tools and ways and means to bring about the change that we desire. But then there is a software involved, which is moral principles or moral values. I think Dr. Chavan touched upon that. A good person. I take this a little further. We need to look at everything that goes on in the realm of education within the prism of moral values, ethical values. Now, this again, you want to get into defining all of that. What values are we talking about? Constitutional or traditional or universal? And we can do that. It has happened in the past. The NCERT spent a lot of time trying to define the kind of values that they wish to propound in schools when they were thinking about promoting value education universally in schools in India. But we need to be conscious of that. There are certain values. I talked about, for example, the nobility of man. Now, I ask my teachers all the time, and anybody who cares to listen, when you look at your children, 20, 30, 40 of them sitting in the classroom, what do you see? Do you see 20, 30, 40 bodies sitting on their desks and benches, or they are bodies with hearts, minds, and souls? So then the way you work with them is going to change. Now that's where change comes in. And you're seeing this change through a prism that denotes a higher consciousness. That's the moral values, the principles involved. So if we are right in choosing the right set of principles, then we can't go wrong. We will never go wrong. And I think we have gone wrong because why has education today become a means for securing a more comfortable and better life for ourselves, or getting a better job and better earning in life? It's because probably somewhere we lost sight of those principles that we had. Somebody mentioned that India has been had a rich tradition of Guru Shishya Parampara and all of that. There were principles involved in all of that. I think somewhere down the line we have forgotten them. We have allowed materialism to take over, and those moral values and principles have been kind of been lost. We need to bring them back. We need to question them. We need to explore them, and then learn how they apply in the work we do. For us, we need to learn how they apply in the field of education.
Thank you so much. Dr. Chavan, any closing comments?
I just spoke just now, so I think
Okay.
I've done my closing comments.
Professor Batra, would you like to say?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I would say that to begin with this idea that the Constitution can change, I think is very, very problematic. And I think the only values that we do have as a reference point is our constitutional values. And those values contain not just questions of liberty, democracy, freedom, justice, but also fraternity. And we seem to forget that fraternity is a very key aspect of a plural society if it wants to sustain itself without the assault of a majoritarianism that we are finding today sort of taking over us. And I personally think that values otherwise then becomes a very, very complex and a tricky question, because then there are sources and sources of values. So do we look at religion? Do we look at morality? How do we look at those? Are very deeply philosophical questions. And therefore, it is a good idea to look at the Constitution as our basic value structure that we need to adhere to. And that's why I began with the idea that whatever it is in terms of looking at bridging gaps and the learning crisis, we have to situate it in the social justice and equity framework. And that'll help us to take it forward, because then we can address questions that are particularly specific to different communities, different children, different marginalized or privileged communities. And there's no need to sort of run a race, which is what education as a commodification has actually made us to do. So we need to release ourselves from there, I think, and come back to some of our classical thinkers, not just the Vedas, but the plural heritage of our country that exists. And I think there's a lot deeply there, which we need to bring to the fore. And luckily in this country, all that hasn't died. We have Sri Aurobindo schools, we have Krishnamurti schools, we have Ramakrishna schools, we have so many alternative kind of education systems. Do we not need to sort of see how we can mainstream some of those ideas that we will be able to then bring to a more systematic way and a systemic way of taking forward? Thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor Dhankar, you have the last word.
In the chronological sense, I do hope. Beyond that, I wouldn't like to venture. Yes, a few things. And we have a long conversation going on between me, Professor Batra, and Dr. Chauhan that is not going to conclude or reach any conclusions today. But since we already into a conversation regarding constitution, etc., therefore I would say a few things on that. Actually, it seems that I agree with both of them, that constitution may change. And at the same time, at the moment, as a political entity, India, the binding force and keeping us together and giving us direction, not only for education, but for our lives and polity, is the constitution. How do both the things stay together? Because the constitution did not come from the sky without any considerations. It has very deep concern about universal humanism in a certain sense. For example, equality of all human beings, and every human being is a possible rational being who can make his or her own decisions. This is the deep-rooted idea behind democracy, and constitutional values spring from that. Now, if we have a better idea of human being than this, and if we have changed the situation in the world, then our constitutional values may change. But at the same time, at this moment, it seems to me that these are pretty rock-solid ideas, and therefore we need to guard against this idea of changing the constitution too frequently, etc. Yes, laws, etc. could be changed, and that's fine. But the basic idea of justice, equality, freedom, dignity of all human beings, I think that's what makes us together in one nation. Part one. Part two, this is good thing that we had a very good debate today. Actually, I'm pleasantly surprised. I did not think that we will have such a good debate. And this partly because of you, Professor Fazli. You invited, I think, very carefully the kind of people who can interact with each other and then produce new ideas. But then, it seems to me that these differing views are good. That brings to me one of Dewey's ideas. He says that most of the problems and dichotomies in educational field particularly, but perhaps everywhere, emerge because of taking one-sided rigid view of a problem. And when actually you go up and see both the views as a particular statement of the same problem, then you perhaps can find a solution. We have been interpreting each other, all of us, including me, I believe, as if they are taking a rigid view. We want to emphasize something and we leave many things unsaid, and then the listener imagines that what is being said is the whole or the totality of what the person says. So we have been doing a bit of that. So I'll do a little bit of that again. You see, I like the idea of eklavya and lots of eklavyas, but I like the kind of eklavyas who refuse to cut their thumbs. So that's one important point. And if the technology gives us an opportunity of producing lots of self-learners, then I think that's great. My point I was trying to make is that you see, human, and that is also partly what Professor Batra said, that humans are natural learners. Yes, Humans have the propensity of making sense of the world, and in that sense, they are natural learners. But at the same time, the ways of making sense, the ways of thinking, the ways of investigating, they are historically developed human capabilities. And if each human being starts developing them again from the beginning, then everyone is going to take about 10,000 years, which simply means that interaction with other human beings who are a little more advanced in that, in helping and directing those natural capabilities to form reasonably justifiable views and opinions is an important thing, and that's where the teacher comes, and that's where the interaction with other human being comes. This does not neglect the idea of humans being natural learners, does not neglect the idea that humans can learn on their own. Last thing, I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time. Last thing, the idea of the trust in the community, and they learn the children, and they know the children, they know the life, etc. Everywhere in the world, particularly in India, again, controversial thing, I'll find very problematic, because there is casteism, there is religious bigotry, there is gender bias, and there are several other kinds of biases which are deep-rooted in the communities. And you can go to a panchayat and you will see judgments are being made on the basis of these biases. So if the school doesn't counter that and goes purely according, and that is true of the middle class as well, and if the school goes purely by the idea of the community in this sense, even if the ideas go against the constitution, I think there is a deep problem in that. So with full respect to the community and its wisdom, I do believe that we as a nation have found some sort of common path through the constitution. And if we gear our education towards that, we might reap better fruits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dhankar, and all our panelists. I mean, I'm sure we would have loved to continue for another hour, but unfortunately we have gone well beyond our time. So thank you all for this very thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. I'm sure there are many questions that still remain, but I'm sure all of us, all participants included, will leave this space much richer in our understanding of these complex issues. And I'd also like to thank the participants who have been very engaged although I apologize that we couldn't have everyone on video and audio because of the large number of participants, but nevertheless, your contributions have been very valuable. We will keep the webinar space open for another 10-15 minutes so that our panelists can respond to the questions. Those who would like to leave, the panelists who would like to leave can, of course, sign out. So with that, we will conclude the webinar. And I'd like to thank everyone once again for this wonderful discussion.